This aircraft flew over enemy cities for years and could not be shot down, not by flak, not by fighters, not by whole powers with all their military might. It was seen in the sky, fingers pointed at it, and nothing at all could be done. Sounds like a fairy tale? It is the plain truth, the kind they tried for decades not to bring into the light. They called it the ghost. And believe me, it earned that name honestly. Where did it come from? Who built a machine that struck not at factories, but at the nerves of whole nations, and why? And why, across the entire war, was not a single such aircraft brought down over one vast country? Not one. Things here are not as simple as the textbooks say, and the most interesting part I have saved for later. There was one single man who dared to climb above the limit, and what happened 30 years later is hard to believe. What kind of aircraft was it? Who pierced its legend? And what truth did the Germans try to hide behind the mask of a peaceful airliner? Stay to the end, and you will learn what was kept silent for far too long. Let's begin. The opening of 1940. British cities lie under an open sky, bare and defenseless, the mightiest empire on the planet, ruler of the seas, terror of half the globe, and it cannot protect its own rooftops from a single machine. Where is the vaunted British defense? Where are the anti-aircraft batteries the island took such pride in? Their shells burst in the air kilometers below the target and reach precisely nothing. The English simply had no weapon capable of touching the Ju-86. That is not an exaggeration, it is a bare fact. The flak guns of that era reached an altitude that, for the German Ghost, was hopelessly low. A shell was fired, it climbed, ran out of breath, and rained back down, never coming close. The aircraft passed over the country as over an empty field, and not a single gun of the Crown could tell it to stop. This relates to the most humiliating position a defending power can find itself in. The enemy is in the sky. He is seen. Fingers point at him. And nothing can be done. Nothing at all. Picture the face of an anti-aircraft commander who watches with his own eyes a foreign machine over his city and knows that his entire arsenal is useless iron. What will he tell the people below? What will he order his crews? To fire into the air to ease his own conscience? 12,000 meters. Remember this number, because it is precisely what made the Ju-86 untouchable. By the standards of the early 40s, this was almost fantasy, practically the edge of the stratosphere, a frontier ordinary combat aviation did not reach even in its boldest trials. Shells did not get there. Interceptors did not climb there. No one rose there at all, except a single aircraft with black crosses on its wings. This relates to the very nature of that threat. From such an altitude, the accuracy of bombing equaled 0, and that will be stated plainly later on. But the Germans did not need accuracy. What they needed was the very ability to come whenever and wherever they wished, paying nothing for it. Impunity in wartime is worth more than gold, and the Reich understood this better than anyone. And here is the contrast that sends a chill down the spine. Below, millions of people, cities, factories, ports, an entire nation risen against Germany. Above, one machine that cannot be shot down, cannot be caught, cannot even be properly made out. Predator and prey. Only the predator holds the altitude, and the prey has nothing but a powerless gaze tilted upward. This relates to the new reality of the air war that the Germans imposed on their enemy first. Before, the sky had been a battlefield where everyone had a chance. Now, it had become the hunting ground of one side. Britain, accustomed to feeling like a fortress behind its sea moat, suddenly discovered that the fortress no longer had a ceiling. And that ceiling was breached not by a fleet, not by an invasion army, but by an unassuming-looking aircraft that until recently had carried passengers. How long would it last? How much longer would city after city live under this invisible pressure, knowing that at any minute, from a height beyond the reach of all the empire's might, an uninvited guest might arrive? To that question, at the start of 1940, no one had an answer. Not the military, not the government, not the engineers feverishly searching for a way to reach the ghost. And it kept flying, and there was nothing to bring it down. 12,000 meters. Weigh this number by the standards of the early 40s. Up there, the air is so thin that a man without a sealed cabin loses consciousness in a matter of moments. Up there, the temperature drops to 50 degrees of cold and beyond. Up there, an ordinary engine chokes for lack of oxygen, and the wings barely find any support in the rarefied air. And that is exactly where the Ju-86 climbed, calmly, routinely, as if out for a stroll. This was not merely great altitude, this was almost the edge of the stratosphere, the very frontier the designers of that day spoke of with bated breath. Combat aviation did not rise there. Production fighters ran out of breath at 8, 9, at most 10,000 meters, and there their ceiling ended. Yet the German Ghost went 2,000–3,000 meters higher still, into a void where no one troubled it. This relates to the very physics of invulnerability. To reach an aircraft, you must lift either a shell up to it or another aircraft up to it. The flak of those years hurled a shell upward, but at 12,000 meters it was already dead weight, losing speed, losing accuracy, raining back down without inflicting any harm. Interceptors simply did not climb that high. The engines lacked air, the pilots lacked oxygen. Altitude itself became armor that could not be pierced. And now, the most curious part. From 12,000 meters, hitting a specific target with a bomb was impossible in principle. Wind, drift, the monstrous release height, all of it turned aimed bombing into a mockery. A bomb let go from such a height could veer hundreds upon hundreds of meters aside, and no one could predict where exactly it would land. One might ask, what sense is there in a bomber that cannot strike what it aims at? This relates to the cold and cynical calculation the Germans built into the very idea. They did not need accuracy, not at all. What they needed was something else. To come whenever they wished, to leave with impunity, and to sow fear by the mere fact of their appearance overhead. A bomb fallen who knows where sometimes frightens more strongly than a bomb landed precisely on target. Because from a precise strike one can take cover on schedule, but from a blind one, nowhere and never. There is the whole arithmetic of this weapon. 0 accuracy and 100% impunity. Below, people do not know where the load will fall and do not know when the next guest will come. Above them hangs a machine that no gun can reach, and that machine drops its load almost at random, precisely because random is more terrifying. Is this not the perfect instrument of pressure upon an entire country worn down by war? This relates to how the German engineers outran their age by years. While their opponents were finishing ordinary bombers built for medium altitudes and precise strikes, the Reich bet on what no one expected, the ceiling. Not on bomb tonnage, not on armor, not on firepower, but on a simple, murderously simple idea, to rise to where no one could follow. And that idea worked so well that the world long failed to find an answer to it. 12,000 meters above the earth, a figure behind which stood an entire strategy of fear, a figure that for several years struck British and Soviet flak from the equation, a figure for which the Germans recut engines, cabins, and the very structure of the aircraft. How they climbed so high, and why no one could repeat it. That comes next. What guides a pilot lining up on a target from 12,000 meters? Calculation? The bomb sight? A precise ballistic computation? Nothing of the sort. The crews of the Ju-86 cared nothing for where exactly their load would fall. They opened the doors, released the bomb into the cold void beneath them, and turned for home without troubling themselves over what, down there, had taken the blow. The aim was not the hit. The aim was the arrival itself. This relates to a doctrine that overturns the familiar notion of bombing. An ordinary bomber exists to strike a factory, a bridge, a depot, a concentration of troops. The Ju-86 existed to strike nerves. 1 or 2 charges aboard, and that was enough. Not for destruction, but to remind an entire country, you are open, you are defenseless. We come when we wish and leave without a single scratch. Impunity in wartime is worth more than gold. The German staffs understood this better than anyone. A single aircraft that cannot be shot down presses on the enemy harder than a squadron of ordinary machines that can be met with fire and thinned out. Because an ordinary squadron is seen, is counted, fighters are sent up against it, and victories are tallied. Against the Ghost, nothing is tallied. You only follow it powerlessly with your eyes.
This relates to the very fabric of the fear the Germans methodically wound around the population. A bomb fallen who knows where and who knows when poisons life more reliably than any schedule of raids. From a precise strike on a factory, the workers hide in the shelter and carry on the shift. From a blind load that may land anywhere, there is no hiding. Not at home, not in the street, not in a field. Anxiety becomes constant, a background hum eating into every day. Here lay the true payload of this aircraft. Not kilograms of explosive, but tons of pressure on the mind. The Germans were selling the enemy a simple and dreadful truth. There is no ceiling above you. Your sky no longer belongs to you. And each solitary visit by the ghost confirmed it anew. What is the calm of an entire city worth? Exactly as much as it took one machine to take that calm away.
This relates to a calculation so cold, it almost compels admiration for its ruthlessness. Why spend dozens of bombers, risk crews, lose machines over the flak, when you can send one invulnerable aircraft and achieve the same effect of panic almost for free? The Reich counted not the tonnage dropped, the Reich counted the minutes of another's fear. And in that ledger, the Ju-86 was the most profitable investment of all. Add to this the complete absence of risk to the crew itself. The machine flew at an altitude where neither shell nor interceptor reached it. The pilot could bomb at random, by area, or miss every target entirely, and calmly return to his airfield in time for supper. Where else in that war was there work with such a ratio, maximum pressure on the enemy at almost zero risk to oneself? This relates to why the Ju-86 was called a ghost not only for its altitude, but for its very manner of operating. It did not join battle. It did not fight for the sky. It simply appeared where it was not expected and could not be stopped, dropped its load, and vanished, leaving below a growing dread. And that dread was more dangerous than any direct hit, because from it there were no shelters, no schedule, no escape. And now it is worth turning back and asking, where did this machine even come from? Who built, and how? A weapon that struck not at targets, but at the nerves of whole nations. The answer reaches back into the years when war was still spoken of in whispers, and combat aircraft were assembled under the signboard of peaceful passenger liners. Where did a defeated country find engineers capable of building a weapon that outran its age? Germany emerged from the First World War humiliated and cut down to size. The Treaty of Versailles bound it hand and foot, a ban on combat aviation, a ban on heavy military hardware, harsh quotas on everything that even faintly smelled of war. The victors were certain they had bled German military thought dry for decades to come. They miscalculated cruelly. This relates to one of the most underrated maneuvers of the 20th century. The Germans did not burn the blueprints and send the designers home. They acted more cunningly. The finest engineers, the very men who had designed the combat machines of the Kaiser's Germany, were quietly dissolved into civilian industry. They were placed across factories producing peaceful equipment, across enterprises to which the victors had no claim whatsoever. The school survived. The hand survived. The mind survived. Lufthansa in this scheme was not merely an airline. It was the airline number one for the entire nation, a showcase, a source of pride, a symbol of revival. And with the backing of the state, with the country's finest specialists under its wing, it achieved striking results where others could only dream. Yet behind the facade of passenger flights and timetables lay something far more serious than the carriage of mail and tourists. This relates to the very nature of the German revenge, ripening slowly and with calculation. Civilian aviation became the incubator of the military kind. Under the guise of developing peaceful liners, technologies were honed that tomorrow would go into bombers. Designers, formerly occupied with passenger comfort, were in fact solving problems of range, ceiling, strength, and engines. The very same problems that would face a combat machine. The line between civilian and military had been erased in advance, before the first order was ever spoken. From the mid-30s, the masks began to fall, one after another. Germany set about openly and swiftly building up its military might, and the political climate in Europe only spurred that acceleration. The Versailles restrictions burst at the seams and were soon cast off altogether. What had accumulated for years in the quiet of civilian design bureaus poured out. Experience, personnel, groundwork, ready technical solutions. The Reich did not have to start from scratch. It already had everything. This relates to the continuity of the German engineering school, which no one ever managed to sever. Those who had designed aircraft in the First World War passed the craft to the next generation. The knowledge did not evaporate, did not scatter, did not perish in the years of prohibition. It flowed from military bureaus into civilian ones and patiently awaited its hour. And when the hour struck, on the designers' tables lay not naive first sketches, but mature, refined ideas, ready to be cast in metal. This is why German machines of the 30s so often proved a head above what the neighbors were building. Behind each of them stood not years, but decades of unbroken schooling. A school the victors at Versailles believed destroyed. They forbade Germany an army, a navy, and an air force, but they failed to forbid it to think, and a thinking engineer with preserved experience is more dangerous than any arsenal. This relates directly to the birth of the very machine in question. It was precisely in this environment, preserved personnel, state support, and a civilian screen, that the conception of the aircraft soon to become the ghost of the European sky matured. It was not built on empty ground. It was carried and nursed by a system that had spent years preparing for the leap. And on one of the days of the mid-30s, that system laid its first trump card on the table. While engaged in creating peaceful passenger machines, Lufthansa was designing combat hardware on the side, and it was done in secret. On paper, a comfortable airliner for carrying respectable passengers. In conception, a bomber able to carry a lethal load across borders. One and the same machine with two faces, and the second face was carefully hidden from outside eyes until the very last moment. This relates to the very heart of the German deception of the 30s. The civilian shell was not a hasty disguise, but a deliberate strategy. The aircraft was drafted from the outset so that it could become either thing. A passenger cabin turned easily into a cargo bay, the peaceful contours concealing combat potential. Versailles forbade bombers but did not forbid passenger liners, and it was precisely into that crack that the Germans slipped. On the 4th of November 1934, the design bureau of the Junkers firm, headed by Ernst Zindel, proposed a variant of the machine that would later become the prototype of the Ju-86. Remember this date and this name. Zindel was no chance figure, but one of those very preserved engineers, a bearer of the school no one had managed to stamp out. From his hand came a project that outran most of its contemporaries in several parameters at once. This relates to the technical breakthrough laid down already in the first drawings. Before the designers stood a monoplane with an all-metal aluminum skin, and this was a true revolution. The German school had previously clung to corrugated skin, the characteristic longitudinal folds of metal that lent strength but weighed the machine down and worsened its aerodynamics. Zindel renounced the corrugation, a smooth metal surface in place of the familiar folds, a step that changed the very philosophy of building an aircraft. But the chief trump was not the skin's metal, but the machine's heart. The Ju-86 was fitted with a Jumo 205C diesel engine, a decision that, for the aircraft building of that period, looked almost like audacity. An aviation diesel was a rarity and an exotic thing, at which many designers merely shook their heads. The Germans, however, saw in it what others had failed to make out: economy, reliability over long ranges, and that reserve which would later let the machine be wrung out to an unreachable altitude. This relates to the very essence of the engineering conception laid at the project's foundation. An all-metal, smooth monoplane with a diesel engine. Each of these elements taken alone was already bold. Together they added up to a machine of a kind not yet built. Light where others added weight. Economical where others burned fuel, and possessed of a reserve for growth that competitors could only dream of.
This was not the modernization of the old, but a bid for a new generation. The genius of the move lay in its duality. The same airframe, the same power plant, the same aerodynamics served equally for carrying passengers and for bearing a combat load. It was enough to change the innards, and the peaceful liner turned into a strike machine.
The Germans built one aircraft and got two at once, and the whole world for a time saw only its harmless, civilian half. This relates to how carefully the Reich kept the shop window apart from the true substance. The public was shown a future airliner. The press was told of comfort and the range of flights, while in closed offices they were already counting how much load the combat version would lift and how high it would climb. Zindel and his bureau worked on two fronts at once, and the second front mattered far more than the first. The project of the 4th of November 1934 was not merely a new aircraft. It was the blank of the future ghost, and very little remained before its first flight in a military skin. In early February of 1936, Lufthansa took into its hands the passenger airliner Ju-86B-0. And what sort of machine was it? Modest in comfort, not especially reliable, striking the demanding public with nothing at all. An ordinary civilian aircraft, of the kind growing ever more numerous in the skies of Europe. That was exactly how they wished to show it to the world: unremarkable, peaceful, not worth a close look. This relates to one of the cleverest substitutions in the history of aviation. While the public examined a plain passenger liner, the military was offered an entirely different machine. It was designated Ju-86A-1, and it was the absolute opposite of its civilian sister. The same route, the same design basis, but the innards, the character, and the purpose drove these two versions to opposite sides of a chasm. One aircraft for the eye, the other for the deed. The bomber possessed characteristics colossal for its time. The fuselage structure resembled a cocoon, a dense, streamlined, self-contained body in which every element worked towards strength and aerodynamics. This was not merely a tube with wings, but a carefully sculpted shell calculated for high loads and great speeds. The silhouette alone betrayed a machine of a new generation. This relates to those engineering solutions reckoned innovative in the aircraft building of that day. The wing of the Ju-86A-1 was twin-spar, cantilever, executed as a trapezoid, without struts or bracing wires, on the inner strength of the structure alone. The tail was split into two fins, lending the machine stability and the characteristic, easily recognized profile. Each of these details, taken singly, was met with elsewhere too, but assembled together they formed a scheme advanced for the 30s. The combat load completed the picture. Depending on the variant, the bomber took in up to 1,000 kilograms of load, an imposing figure for a machine of this class in the mid-30s. This was no longer a hint of a weapon, but a full strike aircraft, able to carry serious weight to a target hundreds of kilometers off. The civilian mask was falling away for good, bearing the combat core beneath. This relates to how the Germans built into the machine from the outset the ability to bite back. Particular attention was given to defense against enemy interceptors. The armament was provided in several variants at once, and at its base lay 3 machine guns, distributed about the machine with purpose. One was given over to the radio operator, another set in the nose turret, and the third hidden in a lower retractable niche covering the aircraft from below. 3 points of fire, 4 above and beneath, turned the bomber into a target one could not approach without risk. There you have the two faces of one machine in their full extent. On the one side, the gray little passenger Ju-86B-0, which Lufthansa showed the world as an unremarkable liner. On the other, the predatory Ju-86A-1 with its cocoon fuselage, trapezoidal wing, twin fins, a ton of load, and 3 barrels. The same aircraft by origin, and 2 entirely different essences by purpose. This relates to the very design the Germans carried through the whole program. The civilian version served as showcase and alibi, the combat one as the true aim of all the work. The world looked at a harmless carrier of passengers and never suspected that beside it, on the same slipways, a strike machine with serious teeth was being born. And yet, the early series of this bomber were still far from perfect. They had their weak spots, which the painstaking Germans would soon set about scrubbing out. There are no perfect machines, and the first series of the Ju-86 was no exception. The bombers that came off the slipways at the very start revealed two serious flaws. The first, wretched all-round visibility. The crew simply could not properly see what was happening around the machine. The second, weak longitudinal stability. The aircraft held its flight path reluctantly, yawing and demanding extra effort from the pilot where there should have been firm support.
For a combat machine, both defects were no trifle, but a threat. This relates to the very nature of any new project, where the first specimens always lay bare what went unnoticed on the drawings. Poor visibility meant the crew spotted the enemy late and oriented themselves worse over the target. Weak stability meant the machine wore the pilot out, hindered a precise run to the release, and lowered the odds in any irregular situation. These two faults together cast doubt on the very combat worth of the early Ju-86. And here the German character showed itself in all its color. Painstaking attention bordering on fanaticism, a distaste for the unfinished, the demand that every part stand in its proper place. All of this the Germans poured into refining the machine almost instantly. They did not reconcile themselves to the flaws, nor put off their correction for later. They took up the rework at once, methodically, without extra words or excuses.
This relates to that very style of work which time and again carried German hardware into the lead. The answer to the defects was the Ju-86G model. In it, they went for a bold solution. The nose section of the fuselage was effectively cut away in its former shape and remade anew, and the control cabin was moved into its place. The recomposition of the forward part of the machine struck at both problems at once, altering both the view from the cabin and the weight distribution on which stability in flight depended. Moving the cabin forward opened to the crew an entirely different picture of space. The pilot and navigator gained a broad, clean view where before there had been a blank wall of metal. The machine ceased to be half-blind. It gained its sight, and that changed everything. The run to the target, the timely detection of danger, and the general sense of confidence at the controls. A single design move removed what had earlier seemed an inborn flaw. This relates also to the second misfortune: longitudinal stability. By changing the shape and layout of the nose section, the designers replayed the distribution of masses along the length of the machine. The aircraft came to hold its line more calmly, to follow its course more surely, to wear the pilot down less on a long route. What in the first series had been a weak spot turned in the Ju-86G version into a virtue. The machine acquired that composure without which a high-altitude reconnaissance plane and bomber has simply no business in the sky. And so, step by step, the early raw bomber was turning into a honed instrument. The Germans let no discovered weakness slip from their hands until it had been scrubbed out to the end. Each new letter in the machine's designation was not a cosmetic touch, but real work on the errors, the refinement of a living, constantly improved project. The machine was sculpted exactingly, the way one sculpts what one is seriously counting on. This relates to the very path of the Ju-86 toward its future fame as a ghost. Before becoming the unreachable master of great altitudes, it had first to cease being half-blind and unstable. And it ceased. But ahead lay a far more serious trial than the desk-bound refinement of drawings, a real war, a real enemy, and a sky in which mistakes are paid for not with a word, but with a machine and a crew. The Ju-86 took its first baptism of fire in the skies of Spain. The machine was folded into the Condor Legion, that very German formation raised to fight on the side of the Francoists and serving at the same time as a vast proving ground for the Reich. Here the Germans ran in their new hardware under real conditions, tested tactics, and watched what their aircraft were good for when fired upon not in exercises, but in earnest. And it was here that the ghost-to-be received its first painful lesson. This relates to a cruel truth that cannot be shown on a factory stand. The Ju-86 of that period did not yet possess the high-altitude characteristics that would later make it a legend. It flew at ordinary heights, within reach of enemy fighters, and was therefore vulnerable. Let an enemy interceptor appear in the sky, and the formidable bomber turned into game that could be chased down and taken. A machine conceived as invulnerable proved in fact an ordinary target. The Germans drew from this an instant and merciless conclusion. They simply halted the serial production of the model. They would not drive into the ranks what burned in combat, would not stamp out knowingly vulnerable machines for the sake of numbers. Instead, they threw all their forces at a single task: to raise the ceiling. If the aircraft is vulnerable where fighters reach it, then it must be taken to where there are no fighters. This relates to the very turn that gave birth to the future Ghost. The failure in Spain did not bury the program but redirected it. From the weak spot was born the chief idea. Salvation lies not in armor, not in speed, not in firepower, but in altitude. Climb higher than all the rest, and no interceptor, no flak gun will reach you. The German designers seized upon this thought and set about wringing every meter of ceiling out of the machine. The result was the high-altitude bomber Ju-86P, brought to trials in February of 1940. This was already an entirely different machine in its capabilities. Its heart became the new Jumo 207A-1 engine, a motor specially refined to work in the rarefied air of great altitudes, there where ordinary engines choke. It was precisely this that gave the thrust without which the conquest of stratospheric frontiers was not even to be dreamed of. This relates to the second key solution, without which the altitude would have stayed unattainable for men. The Ju-86P was fitted with a pressurized cabin.
The crew was sealed in a tight capsule holding the pressure. Otherwise, at 12,000 meters, the pilots would simply have lost consciousness in the rarefied icy air. The pairing of a high-altitude diesel and a pressurized cabin was what carried the machine to that frontier of 12,000 meters, which made it unreachable for both anti-aircraft guns and the enemy's aircraft. Already in the summer, the Germans tried out their new Ghost in the field, calling on the shores of Great Britain and stirring up a commotion there. And here the whole arithmetic of fear stood out in all its bareness. Aboard the machines were just 1 or 2 bombs apiece, a negligible load for a bomber of such a class. But it was not intended to smash factories and ports. Its task was something else. This relates directly to that doctrine which lay at the base of the whole undertaking. 1 or 2 bombs from an unreachable height served not for destruction, but for the creation of panic.
The aircraft came, dropped its symbolic load who knows where, and left with impunity, leaving below an anxiety against which there was neither flak nor fighters. The machine that in Spain had itself been game now turned into the elusive master of another's sky. The weapon was once again fear, and now there was nothing left to bring it down. How long can a legend of invulnerability last? Exactly until the moment the first lucky shot pierces it. For the Ju-86, that moment came in September of 1942. Until that day, the Ghost had walked the enemy's sky as a master, certain that altitude had hidden it forever from any threat. That day changed everything. This relates to the most dangerous delusion into which the strong can ever fall. The Germans had come to believe that 12,000 meters was not merely a height, but an unbreakable wall, that neither shell, nor interceptor, nor human daring itself could reach up there. Years of impunity had accustomed them to the thought that the limit was already taken, and taken forever. And it was precisely this certainty that made them blind to the fact that the enemy, too, had not been standing still. On the other side, there was found a man who refused to accept altitude as a sentence. The English pilot, Emmanuel Galitzine. Remember this name. Around it, the whole resolution of our story will be built. He took his fighter up to where, by every calculation, one was not supposed to climb, to a height of around 13,000 meters, into that very rarefied, icy layer the Germans regarded as their undivided domain. And there, on high, he did what no one before him had managed. This relates to a turning point that ripened unnoticed by the Germans themselves. Galitzine reached the bomber. His fire fell upon the machine.
and the strike landed in the wing of the German aircraft. The Ghost, which by legend could not even be touched, suddenly took a breach, real, tangible, left by enemy fire at that very height held to be forbidden to all. The wall in which the Germans so believed gained its first crack. The German pilot survived that time. With a pierced wing, on a damaged machine, he nonetheless managed to reach his airfield and land. Formally, he got away. Formally, he was not felled from the sky, and a dry report might have recorded the sortie as yet another success. But behind the dry report stood a fact that could no longer be cancelled. For the first time in the whole career of the invulnerable aircraft, it had been hit. And hit where this was held to be impossible. This relates to the difference between a small tactical piece of luck and a great turn in the very essence of the matter. In itself, a single struck aircraft, one that reached its base besides, did not look like a catastrophe.
But it confirmed something far more frightening than any losses. The myth of the Ju-86's complete unreachability was merely a myth. Altitude was no longer absolute armor. A fighter had been found, a pilot had been found, a will had been found, and the enchanted ceiling proved penetrable. Picture what that hit meant for both sides. For the Germans, the first cold signal that their impunity was nearing its limit, that shelter at 12,000 meters was ceasing to be reliable. For the English, the first proof that the Ghost could be reached, that its altitude was no sorcery but merely a technical frontier that, with due persistence, could be taken. One lucky hit overturned the very psychology of the struggle in the upper layers of the sky. This relates to how a single encounter in the air sometimes weighs more than dozens of routine sorties. On the 14th of September, of this exact date and all its circumstances, the account will come further on. It was not merely two aircraft that met. Two ideas met. The German faith in an impenetrable altitude and the English daring that refused to acknowledge that faith. And daring, that time, proved the stronger. Who then was he, this Emmanuel Galitzine, who dared to climb above the limit and pierce a myth before which whole powers had quailed? Where did a man with such a surname come from in the cockpit of a British fighter? His story is a chapter of its own, full of sharp turns, family drama, and a personal score he was settling up there in the icy heights. And it is to that story that we shall now turn. Who then was he, Emmanuel Galitzine, the man who pierced the myth of the German Ghost's inviolability? To understand him, one must go back more than 20 years, to the year 1919. In that year, his father, Vladimir Galitzine, adjutant to the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, managed to break out of the upheaval-stricken land of the Soviets. He fled, not empty-handed. He carried off with him a fine collection of paintings, which would later become the foundation of a new life in a foreign land. This relates to the very root of that personal drama which, many years later, would raise the young man into the icy heights. The family settled in London, and Vladimir Galitzine managed to enter the circle of well-off and influential Englishmen. From time to time, he arranged exhibitions of his paintings, sustaining both his means and his standing in society. On foreign soil, the line did not dissolve, did not perish. It took hold, built itself a niche among British nobility and money. For Emmanuel, the émigré's son, the fate of a member of the Gilded Youth had been laid out. Means, connections, the open doors of London drawing rooms, all of it lay at his feet. And even then the young man stood out among his peers for a daring, at times frankly reckless temper. He was no quiet heir to another's wealth. Something else seethed in him, something that would not let him sit calmly in a warm and well-fed life mapped out for him in advance by others. This relates to the inner score Emmanuel carried within himself. Having gained a pilot's training, he amazed his friends beyond words. A darling of fortune was hardly obliged to take the controls of a combat machine. But when the military campaign flared up between Finland and the USSR, a desire spoke in him to settle his own personal account. He wished to redeem that grievance, that family wound, the shame with which his parent had once been forced to flee his native soil. In the fighting of that time, he did not manage to take part, but it was precisely this striving that brought him into the English Flying Reserve. And, as time would show, it brought him there not in vain. And then came that very day.
The 14th of September, 1942. Having risen from the Northolt airfield to a height of 12,000 meters, the young pilot made out in the sky the characteristic silhouette of a German high-altitude bomber. The Ghost, which for years had walked here with impunity, was this time not alone in its cloud-born realm. Rising to meet it was a man who refused to acknowledge altitude as unassailable. This relates to the very essence of that duel which played out on the edge of the stratosphere. The German pilot, too, noticed the sudden appearance of the Englishman and hastened to be rid of his load, dropping his bomb. Without it, the machine became lighter and could climb higher still. The German tore upward, wringing everything from his aircraft, and reached a mark of around 14,000 meters, a frontier at which it seemed surely no one could reach him now. But even this desperate climb did not save him from attack.
Galitzine followed him and reached him even there. 30 years after the war, this story was fated to receive a rare, almost incredible conclusion. Hauptmann Goetz, that very pilot of that very Ju-86 bomber, met Galitzine face to face. The former enemies, who had once closed in a mortal contest at 12 and 14,000 meters, now sat side by side as living witnesses of one and the same clash. And Goetz confirmed what before could only be guessed at. This relates to the true scale of what the English pilot had accomplished. By the German pilot's own words, after this episode, the operations of raids upon Great Britain were wound down almost at once. One single aerial contest compelled the Reich to abandon sorties that for years had seemed absolutely safe. The Ghost, held to be impenetrable, lost the chief thing after its meeting with Galitzine: its certainty of its own impunity. And without that, the whole strategy of high-altitude intimidation over Britain lost its meaning.
The feat of Emmanuel Galitzine did not dissolve into archival reports. It was marked on a stand of the Air Force Museum, and for a long time it was held to be unrepeated by others of his countrymen. The son of a man who had once fled his homeland with a collection of paintings rose above the limit and did what whole powers, with their flak and their squadrons, could not. The personal score was settled in full, there in the icy heights, where the fate of the legend of the Ghost was decided. Over the Mediterranean, too, the fairy tale of invulnerability came to an end, but not at once. The English did not stop at Galitzine's single successful duel. They set about methodically seeking a remedy for the Ghost, and they found it. Their Spitfire fighters of the Mark V variant they lightened to the limit, stripping away everything superfluous, wringing every meter of ceiling from the machines, and at last they learned to reach the high-altitude Ju-86 in its own domain. The Germans wound down their combat sorties over the Mediterranean region only in August of 1943, when the price of those flights ceased to be zero. This relates to the simple and inexorable law of any arms race. Let one side find a solution, and the enemy's invulnerability begins to melt away. The British paid for their answer with years of searching, reworking, and risk, but they did take from the Ghost its chief advantage over them. Over their sky and over the Mediterranean, the Ju-86 ceased to be master of the situation. The altitude that had once been absolute armor turned, in the war's west, into an ordinary frontier the enemy had finally learned to take. In the east, however, all was otherwise. In Europe and in the war against the USSR, the pilots of the Ju-86 felt utterly unpunished. What in the West already cost blood and losses remained here a safe stroll. The aircraft of this series were folded into reconnaissance squadrons, and they went up into the sky systematically for photography, methodically capturing the places where Soviet units and command posts were stationed. The Ghost in the east did not drop symbolic bombs for the sake of panic. It worked with its eyes, and that work was far more dangerous. This relates to the role the high-altitude reconnaissance plane played in the darkest designs of the Reich. These very same machines the Germans used in planning the invasion of the USSR, photographing foreign land in advance from an unreachable height. And in the winter of 1941, the Ju-86 flew freely over Moscow.
Weigh this. Over the capital of a vast warring power, in its hardest months, a foreign aircraft walked as though the sky over the city belonged to it alone. Why so? Because in the Soviet Union at that time there simply existed no interceptors capable of climbing to such a height.
The flak did not reach, the fighters ran out of breath far below. Exactly the same picture that had once stood over defenseless Britain. Only Britain in the end found its answer, while the Soviet Union never managed to do so. The contrast is merciless. One enemy learned to reach the ghost, the other did not. This relates to perhaps the most staggering fact in this whole story. Throughout the entire period of the Great Patriotic War, not a single Ju-86 was brought down over the territory of the USSR. Not one. Soviet designers never managed to create a fighter of their own with characteristics that would allow an attack on the German pilots at their extreme altitude. The Ghost walked over Soviet land from sortie to sortie and invariably returned, whole, untouched, unreachable to the very end. And yet the time of this machine was running out together with the time of the Reich itself.
Across the whole period, the Germans produced only 822 units of this model, civilian airliners included. By the measure of a great war, that is very few. The Ghost was never a mass weapon. It was a rare weapon, a pinpoint one, betting not on number, but on unreachability. And when the regime that bore it collapsed, so too ended the age of the high-altitude elusive predator. This relates to the quiet, almost workaday finale of the legend. After the war, several hundred of these aircraft were sold to the countries of Europe and Asia, where they were used both as bombers and on peaceful civilian airlines. The machine that had begun its path under the mask of a passenger liner returned, at the sunset of its fate, to that same peaceful role, carrying people and cargo where not long before it had sown fear. The Ghost dissolved into the post-war everyday as imperceptibly as it had once dissolved into the cold blue over defenseless cities.
It was never brought down over Soviet land. It simply flew out its time and passed into history. And so the story of the Ghost that for years could not be reached from the ground comes to a close. A machine that began under the mask of a peaceful liner rewrote the rules of war in the sky and passed into the archive, leaving behind one uncomfortable question. How many more such secrets does the history of military aviation still hold? If this account held you to the very end, support the channel. Hit the like button. It is the best signal that material like this is worth making more of. Subscribe if this is your first time here. Ahead lie dozens more forgotten machines, secret projects, and fates that the textbooks never mention. And be sure to tap the bell so you do not miss the next release, because we always save the most interesting things for later. And what do you make of the Ju-86 and the duel on the edge of the stratosphere? Write in the comments whose side you take and which aircraft we should break down next. We read every message. Until we meet again in the archive.